Hey, Malagashers. My name is Jordan Allen, and I'm just so pleased to be able to talk with you today about what I'm learning in Daniel chapter 3. Just a short introduction about myself. I worked at Malagash as a full-time staff member from the years 1997 to about 2001. It was such a privilege to work there and be living on the camp and ministering. Absolutely loved it. I've been going to Malagash since I was a baby, way back in 1979. My parents brought me to the camp for a family camp there. My wife Beth and I, we have 3 children, Davis, Vera, and now a 4-month-old, Adele, who is keeping us on our toes and keeping us up at night. So things are going well, and I hope things are going well for you. So let's dive in to Daniel, the 3rd chapter there, starting at verse 1. We're going to learn about the 3 teenagers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their stand against their culture at the time, and what we can glean and learn from them. So let's dig in. Verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall, that's about 8 stories, and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers and judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. This is interesting because I'm going to talk a little bit about gods and gods that man creates himself. The gods that man creates, they become more and more like the God that they think they are. So basically, the gods that man creates are a reflection of the people that make them. Because he or she that makes the god can then accommodate for their sinfulness. The difficulty of worshiping the true God of the Bible is that we have to face the reality of our own inadequacy and our own sinfulness. That God is God and much higher than we are. So let's move on to verse 3. So all these officials came and stood before the king, Nebuchadnezzar, and stood before the idol that he had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow down to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace." So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed down to the ground and worshipped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the area is called the plain of Dura, where the statue was. It's in modern-day southern Iraq. There's an archaeologist named Oper who found, way back in the 20s, the huge brick foundation where he thought the statue was. And it's a very large brick foundation. It's about 6 miles from Babylon. If you can imagine, when you're looking across this massive arid land, this big plain, you would see this gold-plated statue shining in the sun. It would have been something else to see. And what Nebuchadnezzar was doing is he was pulling together his nation to bow down to the statue and his gods. He was checking the allegiance of his leaders to make sure they were loyal and faithful to him. And he wanted the unity of the empire. And he saw himself as the head of gold. And it would also feed his ego. What's interesting in the earlier chapters of Daniel is that Daniel is the one who interprets the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And he told Nebuchadnezzar in that dream that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. So maybe the king, maybe this went to his head. I'm not sure, but it's interesting that he made the head of gold. All right, let's move on now to verse 8. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into the blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They paid no attention, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. So, who are these astrologers and some of these people? Well, history shows us that they were Chaldeans. They were an ancient tribe who assimilated into Babylon and who were the court astrologers. And they approached the king to bring their accusation. Undoubtedly, there was resentment against these Jews who had been placed by Nebuchadnezzar in charge of the province of Babylon because they were of another race. And they were also a captive people. It was quite clear to the Chaldeans also that the Jews did not worship the gods of Babylon and were actually a foreign element in government. The form of accusation is interesting. It's almost a rebuke to the king himself. It is clear that the Chaldeans had a deep-seated resentment against the Jews and felt the king had made a serious mistake in trusting these foreigners with such high offices. They remind the king that these men are Jews, different in race and culture from the Babylonians. All right, that's an interesting background on the Chaldeans. Let's move ahead in verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to worship my gods and the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O king, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God of whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Now I want you to notice that the three Jewish young men never try to argue with the historically rash and violent king. Instead, they point to God who is able to rescue them. And also who can save him, or who can save them if he chooses. And that they will never bow down to a false god or an idol. So here's some interesting questions for us then. An idol can be anything you put before God. It can be your car, your wife, your husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, your kids. Kids are a pretty big deal these days for parents. You hear this saying a lot regarding kids, that family is everything. Family is not everything. God is everything. And we need to make sure and check our priorities that they're where they should be. Maybe an idol is conservatism. Maybe it's liberalism. Maybe it's political. Maybe it's social justice. Maybe an idol is sports in your life. Maybe it's video games. Maybe it's your phone. You're spending way too much on your phone. Do we spend more time thinking about material possessions than we do God? How about the love of money? These are all questions that we should ask ourselves. All right, in verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. All right, many archaeologists have found ancient brick in the plains of Dura. Historians believe this large furnace was one of the places used by the kings to make brick in large quantities. That would make sense. For so many of Nebuchadnezzar's buildings made from the work of slaves. The furnace was possibly the huge kiln that would be needed to smelt the metal for the gold plating and to make the bricks for the base and possibly the inner parts of the statue itself. We have pictures of the kilns on bas reliefs from Babylon. It has been estimated that they could reach 1,000 degrees Celsius. Interesting. All right, verse 24. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." This miracle would have been amazing to see, no question about it. We don't know who the 4th man was, whether it was an angel, and some speculate it was Jesus himself. I can only imagine that if that type of miracle had happened to me, I'm going to walk into a brutal, fairly quick death, burning alive, and I wasn't, and I looked around and saw my buddies and possibly Jesus himself. I think I'd be worshiping God. I think I'd be jumping up and down, maybe worshiping, I don't know, but it would have been something to see, and I'm sure the king was absolutely amazed by all this. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officials, officers, governors, advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue the servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they'll be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble." There's that violent king aspect of Nebuchadnezzar. "There is no other God who can rescue like this," he says. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. All right, so some questions to ask of ourselves as we look inwardly here. When was the last time we stood up to our culture for the sake of Christ? Do we just go along with our culture because it's easier and we don't wish to draw attention to ourselves? Do we just agree with the worldviews of our friends if it's convenient? What we see from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is that they would not exchange their trust in God for their comfort. They were willing to die for their faith if it meant not serving false gods. Here's another important question I think that we should ask. Do we leave room for God to do miraculous things in our lives? What do I mean by that? There's been times in my life where I felt that this is way too big for me to handle. Maybe there was some ministry I was getting into. Maybe there was a relationship that I felt needed some help, a support. Maybe a friend or someone I knew that was addicted to something, and I felt over my head to try to help. In those moments in my life, I can look back and say, I cried out to God for help, and He was there. And I saw God work. And I think sometimes in my own life, I feel that if I hadn't have stepped out in faith, then I may not have asked God for help, honestly. I may not have seen God at work in sometimes miraculous ways. And so I want to encourage us all, as we're thinking about these things, that if God is calling us to something bigger, something that feels way too much that we can handle, that's okay. That's one of the things that God is so good at, right? He's the God of the universe. He's huge, and He can handle those things, and He can do miraculous things. So let's give Him room. Let's give Him time. Let's give Him chances to do that in our own lives. All right, here's another question. When was the last time we lovingly said to a friend, a relative, or a coworker about something that doesn't please God, only for the conversation to move toward the things of Jesus? I want to encourage us to be countercultural. And our final question, when was the last time we shared the gospel with someone? I had the opportunity actually last week to share the gospel with someone that I work with. I was working with this person for 2 hours that day, and we got talking, and then she came out. She's about 70 years old, and she kind of talked about her life, and she knew I was a Christian, and she brought up some scripture verses and just went to talk about the things of God, and it was wonderful because that was a giant open door. And so I went through the gospel with her, and it was wonderful. So I'm hoping that this relationship that I've had with this person, working with them for over 10 years now, that it'll continue to blossom and that she would someday come to know the Lord. So in all this Malagashers, we should ask God, help us to be brave. Help us to absolutely be full of faith like these young men. And let's leave room for you to work, oh God.